Venezuela endures a profound and multifaceted crisis, characterized by severe political turmoil, an unprecedented economic collapse, and widespread humanitarian suffering. Millions have fled the country, seeking refuge from hyperinflation, food shortages, and a deteriorating healthcare system. The nation's once vast oil wealth has dwindled, leaving its citizens in dire straits. Amidst this escalating instability, a persistent and often inflammatory question arises. Is a U.S. invasion of Venezuela on the horizon? This query fuels speculation, shapes regional diplomacy, and influences the perceptions of various stakeholders globally. The prospect of external military intervention remains a contentious and deeply concerning topic. Our objective here is to cut through the pervasive noise and shatter the myths surrounding this complex issue. We aim to provide an objective assessment of the probabilities and potential impacts of such an event. This analysis will be grounded in geopolitical realities, strategic considerations, and historical precedents. An executive summary of our findings indicates that a full-scale U.S. invasion of Venezuela is highly improbable. The immense political, military, and economic costs associated with such an undertaking render it an unviable option under current circumstances. The strategic calculus simply does not support such a drastic measure. However, it is crucial to acknowledge that limited military intervention remains a possibility. This would likely occur only in response to specific, major trigger events that fundamentally alter the strategic landscape. Such scenarios would need to present an undeniable and immediate threat to U.S. interests or regional stability. Any direct U.S. military intervention in Venezuela would inevitably provoke a severe regional backlash. Latin American nations, historically wary of external interference, would likely unite in strong condemnation. The specter of Yankee imperialism remains a potent force in the continent's collective memory, fostering deep-seated resistance to such actions. Internationally, such an invasion would face widespread condemnation. The United Nations Security Council would almost certainly see vetoes from permanent members like Russia and China, effectively blocking any international mandate for intervention. This would lead to significant diplomatic isolation for the United States on the global stage. Domestically, there is a distinct lack of broad public and congressional support for military action in Venezuela. The American public remains deeply divided on foreign interventions, particularly after the protracted conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. These experiences have instilled a profound caution regarding large-scale military engagements without clear objectives and exit strategies. Venezuela presents formidable military and logistical challenges for any invading force. It is a vast country, spanning over 900,000 square kilometers, with diverse and often difficult terrain, including dense jungles, mountainous regions, and extensive urban areas. Its population exceeds 30 million people, many of whom could be mobilized or radicalized against an occupying force. A full-scale invasion would represent a massive undertaking, requiring an immense commitment of troops, equipment, and financial resources. The scale of such an operation would likely exceed even the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which involved hundreds of thousands of personnel and cost trillions of dollars over its duration. Sustaining such a force in Venezuela would be extraordinarily complex. The Venezuelan regime is known to be supported by various armed proxies. These include Colombian guerrilla groups, such as elements of the ELN and FARC dissidents, who operate along the porous border regions. Additionally, the regime relies on armed civilian militias, known as colectivos, which are deeply embedded in urban areas and could mount significant resistance. Furthermore, Russia and China maintain strategic interests and influence within Venezuela. They could potentially provide the regime with critical intelligence, advanced air defense systems, and other forms of military aid. This involvement would significantly complicate any intervention, raising the stakes and increasing the potential for a broader geopolitical confrontation. The United States has consistently demonstrated a preference for non-military policy tools in addressing the Venezuelan crisis. Economic sanctions have been a primary instrument, targeting the country's vital oil sector, gold exports, and financial institutions. These measures aim to exert pressure on the regime by limiting its revenue streams and access to international markets. Diplomatic pressure has also been a cornerstone of U.S. strategy. This includes vocal support for opposition figures, such as Juan Guaidó, and efforts to build multilateral coalitions to isolate the Maduro regime. The goal is to foster a united international front advocating for democratic change. A significant focus of U.S. policy has been to push for a negotiated solution and support a democratic transition. This involves encouraging dialogue between the regime and the opposition, often through international mediation. The aim is to achieve a peaceful resolution that restores democratic governance and addresses the humanitarian crisis. Finally, legal and law enforcement actions have been employed to target specific regime officials. These actions often involve indictments for corruption, drug trafficking, and human rights abuses. Such measures aim to hold individuals accountable and further isolate the regime's leadership. While a full-scale invasion is unlikely, certain extreme scenarios could significantly increase the odds of some form of military intervention. One such scenario is a Rwanda-style situation, characterized by state collapse, mass atrocities, or widespread genocide. Should the Venezuelan state completely fail, leading to uncontrolled violence against its own population, international pressure for intervention would become immense. Alternatively, Venezuela could become a failed state that serves as a haven for international terrorist organizations. If non-state actors with global reach establish significant operational bases within Venezuelan territory, posing a direct threat to international security, military action might be considered. This would shift the calculus from internal Venezuelan affairs to broader counter-terrorism objectives. A direct attack on U.S. personnel or interests would also constitute a major trigger event. This could involve an assault on the U.S. Embassy in Caracas or a targeted attack against American citizens residing or traveling within Venezuela. Such an act would be perceived as a direct challenge to U.S. sovereignty and could elicit a swift and forceful military response. Another critical trigger could be a regional military conflict involving Venezuela and a U.S. ally, such as Colombia. If the Venezuelan crisis were to escalate into cross-border hostilities, threatening the stability of a key regional partner, the United States might feel compelled to intervene to protect its allies and prevent wider regional destabilization. Finally, a severe threat to global oil supplies, stemming from hostile action in Venezuela, could prompt military consideration. If the regime were to deliberately disrupt energy markets beyond the effects of sanctions, for instance, by attacking critical infrastructure or blocking vital shipping lanes, the economic implications could be globally catastrophic, potentially leading to intervention to secure energy flows. In any of these extreme scenarios, the discussion would shift away from a full-scale invasion towards more limited military options. These could include the imposition of a no-fly zone over Venezuelan airspace, designed to prevent the regime from using air power against its own population or neighbors. Such a measure would require significant air superiority and sustained patrols. Another potential limited option is a naval blockade, aimed at preventing the flow of goods, including arms and illicit materials, into or out of Venezuela. This would be a complex operation, requiring extensive naval assets and potentially leading to confrontations at sea. The objective would be to further isolate the regime and restrict its capabilities. Targeted strikes represent another limited military option. These could involve precision attacks against specific military installations, command and control centers, or assets used to perpetrate atrocities. Such strikes would aim to degrade the regime's capacity for violence without engaging in a full-scale ground invasion. These limited interventions, while less costly than a full invasion, still carries significant risks. They could lead to unintended escalation, civilian casualties, and prolonged engagement. The decision to employ any of these options would be weighed against the potential for blowback and the achievement of clear strategic objectives. A U.S. invasion of Venezuela would unleash an immediate and profound humanitarian catastrophe. Widespread civilian casualties would be inevitable, as urban warfare and aerial bombardments would devastate populated areas. Critical infrastructure, already fragile, would be destroyed, further crippling essential services like water, electricity, and healthcare. The conflict would trigger an even more massive refugee crisis than currently exists. Millions more Venezuelans would flee their homes, overwhelming neighboring countries and exacerbating regional instability. The sheer scale of displacement would create an unprecedented humanitarian challenge for the international community. An invasion would almost certainly lead to a prolonged and bloody insurgency. Venezuelan nationalism, fueled by resistance to foreign occupation, would galvanize opposition to the invading forces. This would result in years of guerrilla warfare, making the country ungovernable and perpetuating cycles of violence. The task of building a legitimate and stable post-invasion government would be near impossible. The political landscape would be deeply fractured, with competing factions and a populace traumatized by conflict. Establishing democratic institutions and fostering national reconciliation would be an arduous and potentially futile endeavor. For the United States, an invasion would entail immense human and financial costs. Thousands of U.S. troops would likely be killed or wounded in a protracted conflict against a determined insurgency. The financial burden would be staggering, potentially running into trillions of dollars, diverting resources from domestic priorities and other strategic needs. Such an action would severely erode the global reputation of the United States. It would be widely branded as an aggressor, undermining its standing as a proponent of international law and human rights. This would provide a significant boost to anti-U.S. propaganda worldwide, particularly from rival powers. Domestically, an invasion would ignite deep political division within the United States. Public opinion would be sharply polarized, potentially leading to widespread protests and the resurgence of a powerful anti-war movement. This internal strife would further complicate governance and undermine national unity. The long-term consequences would include a significant drain on military resources and personnel. The U.S. armed forces would be tied down in a costly and unpopular occupation, limiting their ability to respond to other global threats. This would have strategic implications for U.S. foreign policy for decades. The region would face an even more massive refugee crisis, far exceeding current levels. Neighboring countries, already struggling with the influx of Venezuelan migrants, would be completely overwhelmed. This would strain social services, create economic instability, and potentially lead to xenophobia and social unrest in host nations. An invasion would cause widespread economic disruption and instability across Latin America and the Caribbean. Trade routes would be affected, investment would dry up, and regional economies would suffer from the ripple effects of conflict. The entire region's development trajectory could be set back significantly. The geopolitical landscape of the region would be fundamentally altered. There could be a potential for a regional arms race as countries seek to bolster their defenses in response to perceived threats and instability. This would divert resources from social programs and further militarize the continent. The invasion would also likely strengthen anti-U.S. sentiment throughout Latin America. Governments and populations would view the intervention as a violation of sovereignty, potentially leading to a resurgence of populist and anti-American political movements. This would complicate future diplomatic relations and cooperation. Globally, a U.S. invasion of Venezuela would represent a major geopolitical escalation. It would create a dangerous flashpoint between the United States and powers like Russia and China, who have interests in the region and would strongly condemn such an action. The potential for proxy conflicts or direct confrontation would increase significantly. Such an intervention would set a dangerous precedent for the use of military force in international relations. It would undermine the principles of national sovereignty and non-intervention, potentially encouraging other powerful nations to unilaterally intervene in the affairs of weaker states. This would destabilize the international order and increase global insecurity. The global economy would also suffer from the disruption of oil markets and increased geopolitical uncertainty. Energy prices could spike, impacting consumers and industries worldwide. The overall climate for international trade and investment would deteriorate, leading to a global economic slowdown. Finally, the invasion would divert international attention and resources from other pressing global challenges. Issues such as climate change, pandemics, and poverty would receive less focus as the world grapples with the immediate crisis in Venezuela. This would have long-term detrimental effects on global cooperation and progress. In conclusion, a comprehensive analysis reveals that the United States has far more to lose than to gain from a full-scale military invasion of Venezuela. The immense political, diplomatic, military, and humanitarian costs associated with such an undertaking far outweigh any conceivable strategic benefits. The historical lessons of past interventions underscore this reality. The current strategy, which prioritizes economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and support for a negotiated democratic transition, remains the preferred course of action. These non-military tools, while imperfect and slow, aim to achieve political change without resorting to the catastrophic consequences of armed conflict. They represent a more sustainable and less destructive path. Therefore, the probability of a full-scale U.S. invasion of Venezuela remains very low under present conditions. The strategic calculus, both domestically and internationally, strongly disfavors such an aggressive posture. Policymakers are acutely aware of the profound and lasting negative repercussions. Military action, in any form, is reserved only for the most extreme and unforeseen contingencies. These would involve scenarios that pose an undeniable and immediate threat to U.S. national security, regional stability, or the prevention of mass atrocities. Absent such extraordinary circumstances, the path forward will continue to be one of sustained pressure and diplomatic engagement.